Did you know cruise ship workers are legally forbidden from revealing what really happens behind closed doors? Welcome to Mr. Nightvale. Today, 10 crew members are risking everything to expose the darkest secrets from inside the industry. From deaths covered up by management to illegal operations running in the ship's morgue, what you're about to hear will change how you see cruises forever. For privacy protection, names and identifying details have been altered. But I guarantee you, every single story is 100% real and verified. Before we begin, drop your location and what time you're watching from in the comments below. Let's dive into the confessions they never wanted you to hear. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell icon for more shocking true stories. My name is Max, and I've carried a secret for 3 years that still wakes me up at night, drenched in sweat and guilt. I worked as a senior security officer on cruise ships for almost a decade, and during that time, I witnessed things that would make passengers think twice before stepping foot on those floating cities. But nothing, absolutely nothing prepared me for what happened during my 6th contract on the Meridian Star. That voyage didn't just change my career, it destroyed whatever was left of my conscience. It was 3 a.m. when the alarm pierced through the silence of the security office. The sound itself was different from the usual fire drills or medical emergencies. This was the one every crew member dreads, the one that makes your stomach drop even before your brain fully processes what's happening. Man overboard. Those 2 words lit up the screen in bright red letters, and within seconds, my entire world shifted into a nightmare I'm still trying to escape. I grabbed my radio and sprinted toward the bridge, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The ship had already initiated the emergency turn, the massive vessel groaning as it began its slow circle back. But here's what passengers never understand, what they could never comprehend, even if someone sat them down and explained it. Those first 15 minutes are everything. After that, you're not really searching for a survivor anymore. You're looking for a body. When I reached the bridge, the atmosphere was controlled chaos. Captain Rodriguez stood at the helm, his face a mask of professional calm that I'd learned to read over the years. Behind his eyes, I could see what he already knew. The call had come in 23 minutes after the passenger was last seen. 23 minutes in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, in the dark, with waves reaching 12 feet. The math was cruel and simple. We were already too late. But protocols demanded we search anyway, so we searched. I coordinated with the deck teams, organized the spotlight crews, and maintained radio contact with the Coast Guard. All of it theater, really. All of it pretending. What passengers don't know, what the cruise lines would never admit, is that we have code words for these situations. When the captain says condition alpha, he's telling the senior staff that survival is possible. When he says condition beta, he means we're looking for remains. And when he says condition gamma, well, that's when you know the search is just for show, for the families, for the lawyers, for the record. 90 minutes into our search, I heard Captain Rodriguez quietly say condition gamma into his radio. That's when I realized I wasn't just witnessing a tragedy anymore. I was becoming part of a cover-up. Here's something that still makes me sick to think about. Down in the crew mess hall, away from passengers, away from cameras, some of the veteran crew members had a betting pool. I'm not talking about a couple of guys making inappropriate jokes to deal with stress. I'm talking about an actual organized system where crew members wagered on how long man-overboard searches would last, whether the person would be found, whether they'd be alive or dead. The first time I discovered it was during my 3rd contract, and I was so disgusted I nearly reported it. But then a senior officer pulled me aside and explained something that changed how I saw everything. He said these people had been working these ships for 15, 20 years. They'd seen dozens of people go overboard. The betting pool wasn't about being cruel. It was about staying sane in a job that forced you to witness death regularly and pretend everything was fine the next morning when passengers lined up for breakfast. That night, during the search for the missing passenger, a man named Robert, who'd apparently been drinking heavily and wandered onto an off-limits deck area. I saw 3 crew members updating the betting pool on someone's phone. And the worst part? I understood why they were doing it. But what happened 6 hours later destroyed whatever rationalization I'd built up. The sun was rising, painting the ocean in shades of orange and pink that felt obscene given what we'd been doing all night. The official search had been scaled back, though we maintained a minimal presence for appearance's sake. That's when Robert's wife and 2 daughters were brought to the bridge. I was there because security is always present during family notifications. I watched Captain Rodriguez, this man I'd respected for years, look this sobbing woman in the eyes and tell her we were doing everything possible, that we had every available resource deployed, that we wouldn't give up hope. Every word was technically true and completely false at the same time. The wife grabbed my arm as she was being escorted out. Her fingers dug into my uniform, and she looked at me with eyes that were drowning in desperate hope. She asked me directly if I thought her husband was still alive, if we'd find him, if I'd seen cases where people survived longer than expected. And I stood there. This 40-year-old man who'd convinced himself he was tough enough for this job, and I lied to her face. I told her stories of miraculous rescues I'd heard about. I told her the water temperature wasn't that cold. I told her that her husband was strong and might have found debris to hold on to. I gave her hope that I knew was false, and I watched her believe me because she needed to believe someone. Have you ever told a lie so complete, so cruel, that you can feel it changing you physically? That's what happened in that moment. I felt something break inside my chest, something that's never quite healed. We abandoned the search officially at hour 18. By that point, even the pretense had become too expensive to maintain. The ship resumed its course. Passengers went back to their vacation activities, and the crew prepared for the next sailing, as if a man hadn't disappeared into the ocean less than a day before. Robert's family was flown off the ship at the next port, and I never saw them again. But I carried their faces with me every single day for the next 4 months of that contract. I started drinking more. I stopped sleeping properly. I'd stand on the deck during my breaks and stare at the water, imagining what Robert's last moments must have been like. Did he scream for help knowing no one would hear him? Did he think about his family? How long did he fight before the ocean won? The breaking point came 2 weeks before the contract ended. Another passenger went overboard, this time an elderly woman with dementia who'd wandered away from her family. Same protocols, same search, same outcome. But this time, when I heard crew members discussing the betting pool, when I heard the code words and saw the performance we put on for the family, I realized I couldn't do it anymore. This wasn't about being tough or handling difficult situations. This was about participating in a system that treated human death as a logistical inconvenience, as a public relations problem to be managed. I submitted my resignation the day we returned to port. My supervisor tried to talk me out of it, explaining that I was throwing away a career, that these situations were rare, that I was letting emotion cloud my judgment. He told me that what we did was necessary, that giving families false hope helped them cope, that the betting pool was just experienced crew members dealing with trauma in their own way. Maybe he was right about some of it. But I knew that if I stayed, if I participated in one more search where I had to lie to one more family, I wouldn't recognize myself in the mirror anymore. Some prices are too high, even for a steady paycheck and world travel. I still think about Robert's wife sometimes. Wonder if she ever found out the truth about how quickly we'd given up. About how her last conversation with me was built entirely on lies I told to make myself feel better about a situation I couldn't control. I wonder if knowing would have made her grief worse, or if the false hope I gave her was actually crueler in the long run. 3 years later, I still don't have an answer. What I do know is that cruise ships have protocols for everything, efficient systems designed to handle any emergency. But no protocol exists for the guilt that comes from looking someone in the eyes and lying about their loved one's chance of survival. No system can process the weight of knowing you're part of a machine that values profit margins over truth. That's the real secret they don't want passengers to know. When someone goes overboard, the search isn't really about finding them. It's about protecting the company, managing liability, and making sure the next cruise leaves on schedule. I couldn't live with that anymore, so I walked away. But walking away doesn't mean you leave the guilt behind. I'm learning that lesson every single day. My name is Layla, and I'm about to tell you about the night that changed everything. 3 weeks into my first contract as a youth activities coordinator on the Ocean Dream, I thought I'd figured out cruise ship life. Wake up, entertain kids all day, eat terrible crew food, sleep in a cabin the size of a closet, repeat. I was wrong. I hadn't even scratched the surface of what really happens below deck, in the places passengers never see, in the spaces that don't exist on any official ship map. The invitation came scrawled on a napkin slipped under my cabin door at 11 p.m. Just 2 words and a number. Deck 2, midnight. Now, here's the thing about cruise ships that nobody tells you during training. Deck 2 doesn't exist. Not officially, anyway. The passenger decks start at 3, crew quarters are scattered throughout. But Deck 2 is this weird liminal space filled with machinery, storage, and areas marked restricted access. I'd walked past those heavy metal doors 100 times without giving them a second thought. But that napkin, with its mysterious message, made my heart race in a way that should have been a warning. Instead, it felt like an invitation to finally be part of something real, something that wasn't corporate-mandated fun or forced crew bonding activities. I showed up at midnight wearing my best off-duty clothes, which wasn't saying much given our luggage restrictions. The corridor was empty and dimly lit, the kind of lighting that makes everything look like a horror movie. I was about to turn back when a door I'd never noticed before cracked open. A Filipino bartender named Rico, someone I'd seen around but never talked to, gestured me inside without saying a word. The moment I stepped through that door, I entered a completely different world. The space had been transformed into something that shouldn't exist on a cruise ship. Someone had strung up actual lights, the kind you see at beach parties, creating this warm glow that made everything feel intimate and alive. There was a makeshift bar constructed from storage crates, stocked with bottles I recognized from the passenger bars upstairs. A DJ booth had been built in the corner, equipment I knew for a fact was supposed to be in the main theater. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, were crew members I'd only seen in their uniforms, looking stressed and exhausted. Here, they were dancing, laughing, drinking like they were actual human beings instead of corporate employees with name tags and forced smiles. Rico handed me a drink, something tropical that definitely came from a bottle worth more than my weekly salary. He leaned close and said the only rule of Deck 2 was simple. What happens here never gets mentioned anywhere else. No photos, no talking about it in crew areas where cameras might pick up audio, no inviting anyone without group approval. Break the rule, and you're not just banned. You become a liability. I nodded, understanding that I'd just been brought into something that could get everyone in this room fired or worse. And instead of being scared, I felt more alive than I had in months. That first night, I met people I'd never have connected with otherwise. Engineers who spoke 3 languages and told stories about working ships in the Mediterranean. Housekeepers who danced like professionals because they'd been performers before taking cruise jobs out of desperation. A chef who made late-night snacks from ingredients he'd borrowed from the main galley, creating food that tasted 1,000 times better than anything served in the crew mess. Everyone had a story about how they'd ended up on this ship, and everyone had secrets they were running from or toward. For the first time since boarding, I felt like I was seeing the real people behind the uniforms and scripted greetings. I started going to Deck 2 every few nights, whenever the napkin invitation appeared under my door. The gatherings weren't always huge parties. Sometimes it was just 5 or 6 people, sitting around talking about home or sharing contraband snacks or watching pirated movies on someone's laptop. The space became a sanctuary, the only place on the entire ship where we could drop the performance and just exist. But it was during the 4th week, during one of the bigger parties, that I met someone who would completely complicate everything. His name was Adrian, and he had this smile that made my stomach flip. We started talking by the makeshift bar, and he told me he worked in guest services, which explained why I hadn't seen him around the youth center. He was funny and easy to talk to, and when he asked if I wanted to get away from the noise, I followed him to a quieter corner without hesitation. We talked for hours that night, about why we'd taken cruise jobs, about the places we wanted to see, about the lives we'd left behind on land. When he kissed me, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, like something that had been building since the moment we met. Over the next 2 weeks, Adrian and I fell into this intense, secret relationship. We'd meet at Deck 2, steal moments together in hidden corners of the ship, send each other coded messages during work hours. Everything about it felt like a beautiful rebellion against the strict regulations and constant surveillance of ship life. He understood the exhaustion of dealing with difficult passengers, the homesickness that hit at random moments, the weird liminal existence of living on a floating hotel, or at least I thought he understood. The truth came out on a Tuesday night. I'd convinced Adrian to skip Deck 2 and meet me in a restricted observation area I'd discovered, a small deck usually locked but accessible if you knew which crew key worked. We were sitting close, watching the ocean under the stars, when he said something that made my blood run cold. He mentioned a passenger complaint he'd handled that day, talking about it from a perspective that didn't make sense if he worked in crew guest services. When I pressed him, asked for details about his role, he got quiet in a way that felt wrong. It took 20 minutes of careful questions before he finally admitted the truth. Adrian wasn't crew. He was a passenger who'd figured out how to access crew areas, who'd been sneaking into Deck 2 for the past month by stealing a crew uniform and ID card from housekeeping. He'd been pretending to be one of us, attending our parties, learning our secrets, all while living in a passenger cabin 6 decks above. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Everything we'd shared, every intimate moment, had been built on a lie. But worse than that, he'd compromised the safety of Deck 2, put dozens of crew members at risk of termination, all for what? The thrill of slumming it with the staff? I should have reported him immediately. I should have told Rico or the others, let them handle it. But I was 24 years old and stupidly in love with someone who'd been playing pretend So instead, I told Adrian he had to stop coming to crew areas, that what he was doing was dangerous and selfish. He promised he would, kissed me like it meant something. And I believed him because I wanted to. 2 nights later, everything fell apart. I was meeting Adrian in our secret observation spot, planning to end things properly when the door burst open and the assistant cruise director stood there with a security officer. They'd been tracking unauthorized access to restricted areas and followed Adrian straight to me. The questions came fast. How long had this been going on? How did a passenger get crew access? Who else was involved? And the big one, the question that made my heart stop. What is Deck 2? Apparently, Adrian had been overheard talking about Deck 2 in a passenger bar, drunk and bragging about his secret access to crew parties. Someone reported it. And now the entire operation was at risk of being discovered. The assistant cruise director made it very clear. I could tell them everything about Deck 2, about who organized it, about the stolen alcohol and contraband, and maybe keep my job. Or I could refuse to cooperate and be terminated immediately, probably blacklisted from ever working cruise ships again. I thought about Rico taking a chance on me, inviting a new crew member into a space that meant everything to people who had nothing else. I thought about the chef who made special food just to see people smile. I thought about the housekeepers who danced like they were free. And I thought about Adrian, a passenger who treated our lives like entertainment, who'd put all of those people at risk because he was bored with his vacation. The choice should have been impossible, but it wasn't. I looked the assistant cruise director in the eye and told them I had no idea what they were talking about. Deck 2? Never heard of it. Adrian must have been confused, probably drunk, making up stories to impress someone. I maintained that story through 2 hours of questioning, through threats of termination, through everything they threw at me. Eventually, they couldn't prove anything without my cooperation, and the investigation stalled. They fired me anyway, of course. Fraternizing with a passenger was enough grounds for immediate termination, even without the Deck 2 connection. I was off the ship at the next port, my contract voided, my dream of traveling the world while getting paid officially over. But before I left, Rico slipped me an envelope. Inside was cash, contributions from the Deck 2 crew, enough to cover my flight home and then some. And a note that just said, "Family protects family." I never saw Adrian again. I heard later that he completed his cruise and left without consequences. Probably went home and told the story at dinner parties about his wild adventures sneaking into crew areas. Meanwhile, dozens of crew members kept their jobs because I refused to give up their sanctuary. Was it worth it? I lost my career, my income, my plans. But when I think about those nights on Deck 2, about the real connections I made, about choosing loyalty over self-preservation, I can't bring myself to regret it. Some things matter more than a paycheck. Some secrets are worth keeping. And some spaces, the ones where people can be human instead of employees, are sacred enough to protect, even when protection costs you everything. That's what I learned on Deck 2, in the place that doesn't exist, during the time that changed who I am. And I'd make the same choice again, every single time. My name is Birdie, and for 6 months I convinced myself I was imagining things. That's what happens when you work night shifts in a medical bay on a cruise ship. The isolation, the fluorescent lights, the constant hum of engines beneath your feet. It messes with your head, makes you see patterns where there aren't any, makes you question your own perception. Except, I wasn't imagining anything. What I discovered in the morgue was real. And the fact that I knew about it made me a liability to people who had absolutely nothing to lose. It started during my 4th month on the Atlantic Voyager. I'd been assigned permanent night shift because I was new and low seniority, which meant 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. in a medical bay that rarely saw emergencies. Most nights I'd handle seasickness, minor injuries from drunk passengers, occasionally an elderly guest having heart palpitations. Boring work, lonely work, but it paid well and gave me experience. The medical bay was located on deck 4, tucked away where passengers wouldn't stumble across it accidentally. And right next to our supply closet, separated by a reinforced door with biometric access, was the ship's morgue. Every cruise ship has one. It's not something they advertise in the brochures, but when you've got 4,000 passengers and 1,000 crew members on a 2-week voyage, statistically someone's going to die. Heart attacks, strokes, accidents. It happens more than people realize. The morgue on the Atlantic Voyager could hold 4 bodies, kept in refrigerated drawers at exactly 36 degrees. In my 4 months aboard, we'd used it twice. Both times, elderly passengers with pre-existing conditions. Both times, everything handled by the book. Bodies stored respectfully, families notified, paperwork filed. Clean, professional, sad but expected. That's why what happened at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday made my skin crawl. I'd been restocking bandages when I realized we were completely out of surgical gloves. The main supply closet was empty, which meant I needed to access the secondary storage area adjacent to the morgue. I grabbed the master key from the duty nurse's desk, a key I'd only used once before during training, and headed down the corridor. The ship was quiet at that hour, just the ever-present engine noise and the occasional creak of metal. When I reached the storage area, I noticed the morgue access light was green instead of red. Green meant someone was inside. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe the senior medical officer was doing inventory. Maybe there'd been a death I hadn't been informed about yet. But something made me check the logbook on the wall, the physical paper log we still maintained as backup to the digital system. The last entry was from 9 days ago. The last body had been removed 7 days ago for transport at port. Nobody should be in the morgue. Nobody had any reason to be accessing a morgue that contained no bodies. I should have walked away. Every instinct I had screamed at me to grab the gloves and go back to the medical bay and forget what I'd seen. But I've always been too detail-oriented for my own good, too focused on things being correct and proper. It's what makes me good at my job and terrible at knowing when to mind my own business. So instead of leaving, I waited in the shadows of the supply area, watching the morgue door. 15 minutes later, it opened. The person who emerged wasn't medical staff. He was an engineer, identifiable by the uniform, carrying a canvas duffel bag that looked heavy and full. He glanced around nervously, didn't see me hidden behind a supply cart, and hurried down the corridor toward the crew elevator. The morgue door closed behind him, the light switching back to red, locked and secured. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it over the engine noise. An engineer had no business in the morgue. None whatsoever. And that duffel bag, the way he carried it, the nervous energy, everything about it was wrong. I logged the incident in my personal phone, noting the time and what I'd witnessed. Then I did something incredibly stupid. I accessed the morgue digital log from the medical bay computer, using my credentials to pull up access history. What I found made my blood run cold. Over the past 3 months, the morgue had been accessed 47 times. But according to official records, we'd only had 5 deaths during that period. Someone was entering the morgue regularly, multiple times per week, always during night shifts, always between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. And it wasn't just the engineer I'd seen. The biometric log showed 4 different crew member IDs, none of them medical staff. The smart thing would have been to report it immediately. Go to the chief medical officer or security or the captain. Let people above my pay grade handle whatever was happening. But I was 29 years old and terrified of being wrong, of making accusations I couldn't prove, of looking paranoid and incompetent. So instead, I decided to gather more evidence. I started keeping detailed notes of every morgue access that happened during my shifts, correlating them with ship schedules and port stops. And 3 nights later, I followed one of them inside. His name was Dmitri, according to his ID badge. He was part of the engineering crew, someone I'd seen around but never spoken to. I watched him access the morgue at 2:30 a.m., and this time I'd positioned myself where I could slip in behind him before the door fully closed. The morgue was exactly as cold as it should be, the refrigeration units humming efficiently. Dmitri didn't notice me at first. He was too focused on opening one of the body drawers, the one in the far corner. Except when he pulled it open, there was no body inside. Instead, the drawer was packed with packages wrapped in black plastic, sealed with tape, arranged efficiently to maximize space. I must have made a noise, some involuntary gasp or movement, because Dmitri spun around and saw me. The look on his face went from shock to calculation to something threatening in about 3 seconds. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there blocking my view of the drawer, his body language screaming danger. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and controlled in a way that was more terrifying than if he'd yelled. He asked what I was doing there. I stammered something about supply inventory, about checking morgue temperature logs, excuses that sounded pathetic even to my own ears. Dmitri smiled, but it wasn't friendly. He told me I'd made a serious mistake, that I'd seen something I shouldn't have, and now we had a problem. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call, speaking in Russian too fast for me to understand more than a few words. Within 5 minutes, 2 more people arrived. A bartender named Chen and a housekeeping supervisor named Katya. The 3 of them blocked the morgue exit, and I realized I was trapped in a refrigerated room with people who were using a ship's morgue for smuggling and had absolutely no reason to let me walk away. Katya did most of the talking. She was calm, almost friendly, which somehow made it worse. She explained that what I'd discovered was a supply chain operation that had been running for 2 years across multiple ships. They used the morgue because it was the one place on the ship that crew could access without raising suspicion, that had climate control, that security rarely bothered to monitor closely. The packages I'd seen were cigarettes, alcohol, medication, even jewelry. Items purchased at certain ports where they were cheap, smuggled aboard in body bags when real deceased passengers were transported, then sold at other ports for profit. The operation involved about a dozen crew members and generated thousands of dollars per voyage. She made it sound almost reasonable, almost legitimate. Just crew members trying to make extra money in a system that paid them poverty wages while passengers spent millions. But then she got to the part that made my chest tighten with fear. She said I had 2 choices. I could join them, take a cut of the profits, and help maintain their system by alerting them if anyone else got suspicious. Or I could refuse, and they'd make sure I was framed for theft. They had access to passenger cabins, to storage areas, to security footage. It would be easy to plant evidence, to make it look like I'd been stealing medication from the medical bay and selling it to crew. My word against theirs, a new nurse versus veteran crew members with years of service and clean records. The morgue felt impossibly cold. I was shivering, and not just from the temperature. every principle I had, everything I believed about doing the right thing, was screaming at me to refuse, to report them, to not become complicit in something illegal. But I was also terrified. I'd seen enough of ship politics to know that crew members who caused problems had accidents, got left at ports, disappeared from contracts, and no one asked questions. These people had been running this operation for 2 years. They were organized, connected, and clearly willing to do whatever it took to protect it. I told them I needed time to think. Katya laughed and said I had, until the end of my shift. 6 hours to decide whether I valued my principles or my safety more. They let me leave the morgue, but the threat hung in the air like something physical. I went back to the medical bay and spent the rest of my shift in a state of pure panic, my hands shaking every time I had to handle something, my mind racing through scenarios. If I reported them and they followed through on their threat, I'd lose my nursing license, probably face criminal charges. If I stayed silent, I'd be complicit in smuggling operations that could potentially put the entire ship at risk if something went wrong. What passengers don't understand about cruise ship life is how isolated it really is. You're in the middle of the ocean with nowhere to go, surrounded by people who might be your colleagues or might be criminals, with no way to know who to trust. The normal support systems don't exist. Report something to the wrong person, and suddenly you're the problem. Stand up for what's right, and you might find yourself swimming home. When my shift ended at 7 a.m., I made my decision. I went directly to the chief medical officer, a woman named Dr. Elena, who'd always been fair with me. I told her everything I'd discovered, showed her my logs, explained about the threats. She listened without interrupting, her face getting more serious with every detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she told me to pack my things, that I'd be leaving the ship at the next port in 6 hours, and that I should never work cruise ships again if I valued my safety. She wasn't helping them. She was protecting me, because the smuggling operation involved crew members from multiple departments, people with connections and power I didn't have. If I stayed aboard, if I became part of an official investigation, I'd be a target. The best thing I could do was disappear, leave before they could retaliate, and let people with more authority handle it from a distance. Dr. Elena promised she'd report it through proper channels, through corporate security systems that I couldn't access. But she made it clear I needed to be gone first. I left the Atlantic Voyager that afternoon. They cited family emergency as the reason for my contract termination, and none of the crew members involved in the smuggling operation ever knew that I'd reported them. I heard later, through the crew grapevine that exists across all cruise lines, that there was an investigation, that some people were quietly let go, that the morgue access protocols were changed. But nothing official was ever announced, no criminal charges filed that I know of. The cruise line handled it internally, the way they handle everything that might damage their reputation. I work at a hospital on land now. Regular shifts, normal emergencies, morgues that are properly supervised and only used for their intended purpose. I tell people I left cruise ships because I missed being close to family, and that's partially true. But the real reason is that I learned something about institutional corruption that I can't unlearn. Sometimes the right choice isn't between good and evil. Sometimes it's between self-preservation and principles. And sometimes choosing principles means losing everything. I chose to report what I saw, and it cost me my career at sea, my sense of safety, and my belief that doing the right thing always matters. 3 years later, I still don't know if I made the right choice. But I know I couldn't have made any other one, and still lived with myself. That has to count for something. My name is Daniel, and I stopped seeing passengers as people somewhere around year 7. That's what happens when you spend a decade cleaning up after strangers who treat you like furniture, who snap their fingers for service, who complain that their towel animals aren't creative enough while you're working your 5th 12-hour shift in a row. You build walls. You smile with your mouth, but not your eyes. You do the job perfectly because you're professional, but you stop caring because caring hurts too much. For 8 years, I was the best cabin steward on the Caribbean Empress, and I felt absolutely nothing. Then I met a woman named Margaret, who reminded me what it means to be human. And by the time I learned that lesson, it was too late to thank her. I'd been working cruise ships since I was 36, sending money home to family in the Philippines, living in a cabin smaller than most people's closets, and perfecting the art of invisible service. I could clean a suite in 14 minutes, fold towels into 12 different animal shapes, anticipate passenger needs before they vocalize them. I had guest satisfaction scores in the top 5% fleet-wide, and I hated every single one of them. Not the passengers individually, but the collective entity of entitled tourists who saw me as a service robot instead of a 44-year-old man with a degree in hospitality management who'd taken this job out of economic necessity, not passion. You want to know what kills empathy? Try being screamed at because the water pressure isn't quite right. Try having passengers leave their rooms destroyed, garbage everywhere, bathroom unusable, and then complain that you didn't clean well enough. Try being reported for not smiling enthusiastically enough while you're running on 4 hours of sleep. Try all of that for 8 years straight, and see if you still have the energy to care about anyone's vacation experience. I didn't. I went through the motions flawlessly, collected my pay, sent it home, and counted days until my contract ended. That was my life, and I'd made peace with the emptiness of it. Margaret was assigned to my section during a 14-day Caribbean cruise in late September. She had a mid-tier balcony cabin, nothing fancy. And when I introduced myself during embarkation, she smiled like I'd said something wonderful instead of just offering the standard welcome speech I'd given 10,000 times. She was probably in her early 70s, traveling alone, moving carefully like someone whose body had started betraying them. When I asked if she needed any special accommodations, she just said she'd appreciate if I could check on her each evening during turn-down service. Not unusual. Elderly solo travelers often requested extra attention for safety reasons. The first thing that surprised me was the note. After I'd finished her first turn-down service, arranging the chocolates and tomorrow's itinerary, she'd left a handwritten card on the desk. It thanked me by name for making her cabin feel welcoming, mentioned specific details about how I'd arranged her belongings, and told me she could tell I took pride in my work. Nobody had written me a note before. Tips, yes. Complaints, definitely. But not personal thank you cards in careful handwriting that acknowledged me as an actual person. The second night, there was another note. This one asked about my life, where I was from, how long I'd been working ships. Next to it was a modest tip, nothing extraordinary. But the note felt more valuable somehow. I almost didn't respond. 8 years of emotional walls don't come down because someone writes a nice card. But something about her handwriting, the genuine curiosity, made me break my own rules. During turn-down service that evening, when she was sitting on her balcony watching the sunset, I actually talked to her. Really talked, not just the scripted passenger service dialogue. That's how our routine started. Every evening during turn-down, Margaret would be on her balcony or sitting in the chair by the window, and we'd talk for 10, 15 minutes. She asked about my family, my home, what I did before cruise ships. I told her things I hadn't spoken about in years. About my daughter who was studying engineering. About my mother who needed medical care. About the architecture degree I'd never used because there were no jobs when I graduated. And she listened like my story mattered. Like I wasn't just the staff member who folded her towels. She told me about her life too. 47 years as a teacher. 3 children who were all successful and busy with their own families. A husband who'd passed 6 years earlier. She'd been planning this cruise for months, saving up for it, choosing the Caribbean because she'd always wanted to see these islands, but never had the time. There was something in the way she talked about the trip, a finality that I didn't quite understand at first. Like she was memorizing everything, storing up experiences for some future that wouldn't have new ones. On the 6th night, she told me the truth. She'd been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer 8 months ago. The doctors had given her maybe 3 to 6 months, and she'd refused aggressive treatment that would leave her sick and miserable. This cruise was her goodbye to the world, her final adventure before she entered hospice care. Her children didn't know she'd taken the trip. They would have tried to stop her, worried about her being alone, insisted on coming with her and turning it into a sad family obligation. She wanted these 2 weeks to be hers alone, to prove she was still herself before the disease took everything. The way she said it, calm and matter-of-fact, made my chest feel tight. Here was a woman who knew she was dying, who'd chosen to spend her final healthy days on a cruise ship, and she'd spent part of that precious time talking to me, asking about my life, treating me like a friend instead of hired help. I didn't know what to say. My professional training hadn't covered how to respond when a dying passenger tells you they're on their last adventure. So I just said I was honored she'd shared that with me, and that I'd make sure her cabin was perfect every single day. Something shifted in me after that conversation. I started actually seeing her, not as cabin 8247 that needed servicing, but as Margaret, a person with limited time who'd chosen to spend some of it being kind to a stranger. I brought her extra pillows without being asked when I noticed she was uncomfortable. I researched the ports we visited and left her personalized suggestions for accessible excursions. I made sure her coffee was exactly the right temperature every morning. And every evening, we talked about life, about regrets, about what mattered when you could see the end approaching. She told me things I'll never forget. How she regretted not traveling more when she was younger, always putting it off for some day that almost never came. How her biggest accomplishment wasn't her career, but the small kindnesses she'd shown to students who needed someone to believe in them. How she wished she'd worried less about what people thought and just lived more authentically. And then one night, she said something that broke through all my carefully maintained walls. She told me I was too young to be as cynical as I was, that she could see I was protecting myself by not caring, and that she understood why, but hoped I'd find a way back to feeling things again. Nobody had seen through me like that in years. I'd gotten so good at the performance, at being professionally pleasant while feeling nothing. And here was this dying woman, using her limited energy to worry about my emotional state, to try to help me reconnect with empathy I'd buried under years of mistreatment and exhaustion. I didn't admit she was right, but we both knew she was. On the 11th day of the cruise, Margaret didn't answer when I knocked for evening turn down. I used my master key and found her in bed, looking peaceful, like she was sleeping. But I'd been working cruise ships long enough to recognize death. I checked for a pulse I knew I wouldn't find, then called the medical team and followed protocol exactly. The doctor confirmed she'd passed sometime that afternoon, likely painlessly, probably just fell asleep and didn't wake up. Her final days had been exactly what she'd wanted, independence, dignity, beautiful views, and peace. The procedure for deceased passengers is clinical and efficient. Medical team handles the body, security secures the cabin, passenger services contacts next of kin, and cabin stewards prepare the room for investigation and eventual clearance. I'd been through it before, the mechanical process of death logistics. But this time felt different. This time I was cleaning the cabin of someone I'd known, someone who'd mattered to me, someone whose absence left an actual hole instead of just an empty room number. When I was clearing her personal items for inventory, following procedure, I found an envelope with my name on it sitting on the desk. Inside was a letter in her careful handwriting and a check that made my hands shake. The letter thanked me for making her final voyage special, for treating her like a person instead of just another passenger, for sharing my story with her. She said she hoped I'd use the money enclosed to visit my family, to take time away from the ship, to remember that life was short and connections with other people were all that really mattered in the end. The check was for $15,000, more money than I'd make in 6 months of 12-hour shifts. Money that would cover my mother's medical bills, let me take my daughter somewhere special, give me breathing room I hadn't had in years. But more than the money, it was the recognition that our conversations had mattered to her, that I'd given her something valuable during her last days, even though I'd thought I was just doing my job. I couldn't work the rest of that voyage. I told my supervisor I needed to process a death of a passenger I'd grown close to. And for once, the cruise line showed humanity. They gave me 3 days of paid leave, let me stay in my cabin and just exist without obligations. I spent those days reading Margaret's letter over and over, thinking about everything she'd said during our evening conversations, realizing how much of herself she'd shared with a stranger because she wanted her final human connections to mean something. When I returned to work, something fundamental had changed. I started seeing passengers again. Not all of them. Not the truly awful ones who no amount of empathy could make bearable. But the regular people, the families on vacation, the couples celebrating anniversaries, the solo travelers looking for adventure or escape. I noticed when someone was lonely or scared or struggling. I made small talk that wasn't just script. I let myself care again, carefully, in measured doses that wouldn't destroy me, but would make the job feel less like emotional death. The money Margaret left changed my practical life. I took a month off between contracts, went home, spent real time with my family instead of just sending checks. I paid for my mother's treatment and my daughter's tuition without the constant stress of calculating whether I could afford both. But the bigger gift was the reminder that I was still capable of human connection, that I hadn't become the emotionally dead service robot I'd been performing as for 8 years. I'm 48 now, still working cruise ships because the money's still necessary and I'm still good at the job. But I work differently. I remember that passengers are people having their own experiences, some joyful, some desperate, some final. I don't let myself be abused, but I also don't shut down completely. I try to be the person Margaret saw in me instead of the cynical shell I'd become. Some days it's harder than others. Some passengers make it nearly impossible. But then I remember a 72-year-old woman who used her dying days to show kindness to a stranger. And I try to honor that by staying human myself. I keep her letter in my cabin, tucked into the book I reread when contracts feel endless. Sometimes I take it out and remind myself why empathy matters, why small kindnesses count, why treating people like people instead of transactions is worth the emotional risk. Margaret didn't save my life, but she saved something more important. She saved my ability to feel, to connect, to believe that human decency still matters, even in a job designed to reduce people to room numbers and satisfaction scores. That's the inheritance that changed everything. Not the money, though, that helped immensely, but the reminder that we're all just people trying to matter to someone before our time runs out, and sometimes mattering to just one person is enough. My name is Anton, and I used to believe that maritime safety regulations existed for a reason, that experienced engineers prioritized passenger lives over profit margins, that the systems designed to prevent disasters actually worked. I was 27 years old and 3 years into my marine engineering career when I discovered how catastrophically wrong I was. What I witnessed in the engine room of the Pacific Horizon didn't just destroy my faith in the industry. It taught me that sometimes the most dangerous people aren't the ones who cause accidents. They're the ones who see disasters coming and choose to ignore them because stopping would cost too much money. I'd graduated top of my class from Maritime Academy, passed every certification exam on the first try, and genuinely loved the technical challenges of keeping massive ships operational. The engine room was my cathedral. All that machinery working in perfect synchronization to move thousands of tons through the ocean. I took pride in understanding every system, every backup protocol, every safety measure designed to prevent catastrophic failure. That pride, that attention to detail, is exactly what made me notice the crack that everyone else decided to pretend didn't exist. It was day 3 of a 7-day Caribbean cruise, and I was conducting my routine morning inspection of the propulsion system. Standard procedure, something I'd done hundreds of times. Check the shaft alignment, monitor bearing temperatures, inspect for unusual vibrations or sounds, document everything in the maintenance log. The Pacific Horizon had twin propulsion shafts, each one massive pieces of forged steel that transmitted power from the engines to the propellers. These shafts are engineered to handle incredible stress, designed with redundancy and safety margins that should make failure nearly impossible. That's why when I saw the crack, my first reaction was disbelief. It ran along the starboard propulsion shaft about 6 feet from the main bearing, a hairline fracture that had propagated into something wider, maybe 3 millimeters at its widest point. I checked it 3 times, used my flashlight from different angles, even grabbed my phone and took photos because I couldn't quite believe what I was seeing. This wasn't normal wear. This was structural failure in progress, the kind of damage that maritime engineering textbooks use as case studies for catastrophic accidents that should never happen. Protocol was absolutely clear. Critical structural damage to propulsion systems requires immediate shutdown, engineering assessment, and possible return to port. You don't continue operating a ship with a cracked propulsion shaft. The stress of normal operation could propagate that crack until the shaft fails completely. And when a propulsion shaft fails at speed, the results are catastrophic. The shaft can tear through the hull, cause massive flooding, potentially sink the ship. This wasn't a judgment call. This was a shut-down immediately situation by every standard in maritime engineering. I documented everything with photos and measurements, then went directly to the chief engineer. His name was Thomas, a man with 30 years of experience, who I'd respected since boarding. I showed him the photos, explained the location and severity, waited for him to initiate emergency protocols. Instead, he looked at the images for maybe 10 seconds, handed my phone back, and told me it was surface oxidation, nothing to worry about. When I started to argue, to point out that I'd physically measured the crack depth, he cut me off. He said I was young and inexperienced, that I was seeing problems where none existed, and that if I wanted to keep my position, I'd learn to tell the difference between minor cosmetic damage and actual structural issues. I stood there, 27 years old, holding documentation of a critical failure, being told by my superior that I didn't know what I was seeing. Every instinct screamed that he was wrong, that this was dangerous, that we needed to stop the ship. But I was also a junior engineer with 3 years of experience being dismissed by a chief engineer with 3 decades. The hierarchy on ships is absolute. You don't argue with senior officers, especially not when they've made their position clear. So I went back to my station, filled with this sick feeling that something was terribly wrong beyond just the mechanical failure. Over the next few hours, I couldn't let it go. I kept thinking about that crack, about the stress calculations, about what would happen if it failed. During my lunch break, I went back to check it again, half hoping I'd been wrong, that Thomas was right and I'd overreacted. The crack had grown, not by much, maybe half a millimeter, but it had definitely propagated. That's when I knew with absolute certainty that we were in danger, and that the chief engineer had lied to me about what he'd seen. That evening, I was doing routine checks near the officers' planning room when I heard voices. The door wasn't fully closed, and I recognized Thomas's voice along with the staff captain and the hotel director. They were discussing the propulsion shaft. I stopped and listened, knowing I shouldn't but unable to walk away. What I heard made my blood run cold. They knew about the crack. Thomas had immediately reported it to senior officers after dismissing my concerns. But instead of initiating safety protocols, they were discussing what they called acceptable risk calculations. The hotel director was arguing that returning to port would cost the company millions. Passenger refunds, port fees, reputation damage, missed revenue from the next scheduled cruise. The staff captain was talking about liability exposure if they continued and something went wrong. And Thomas, the man I'd respected, was explaining that the crack would likely hold for the remaining 4 days if they reduced speed slightly and monitored it constantly. He estimated maybe 15% chance of catastrophic failure, which he characterized as acceptable given the financial stakes involved. 15%. They were gambling with a 15% chance of disaster affecting 4,000 passengers and 1,200 crew members because stopping would hurt quarterly profits. I stood frozen in that corridor, listening to people calculate acceptable risk for other people's lives. And I realized I was witnessing something criminal disguised as practical decision-making. When the meeting ended, I barely made it back to the engine room before they came out. My hands were shaking so badly I could hardly hold my tools. What do you do when you discover your superiors are knowingly endangering thousands of lives? The chain of command says report to your superior, but my superior was orchestrating the cover-up. Company policy says use the safety reporting system, but that system goes through officers who were part of the decision. I could try to contact corporate headquarters, but I was a junior engineer with no proof except my word against senior officers with decades of reputation. And underlying all of it was the certainty that if I made waves, I'd lose my job, probably get blacklisted from the industry, and likely wouldn't change anything anyway. But I couldn't just do nothing. So I started documenting everything. I took photos of the crack every 6 hours, measuring its propagation with calipers. I secretly recorded audio from the engine room, capturing the unusual vibrations the damaged shaft was producing. I kept detailed logs with timestamps, created backup copies on multiple devices, even emailed encrypted files to my personal account. If something went wrong, if this ship went down because of decisions I'd witnessed, I wanted evidence that someone had known and chosen profit over safety. The next 3 days were the most stressful of my life. I worked my regular shifts plus overtime because Thomas had assigned me and 2 other junior engineers to constant monitoring of the damaged shaft. We were implementing what he called preventive measures. which really meant temporary fixes that might buy time but did nothing to address the fundamental structural failure. We adjusted bearing alignment, modified shaft loading, reduced operational speed by 3 knots. All of it was Band-Aid solutions on a problem that required shipyard repair. The other junior engineers didn't question it. They trusted that senior officers knew what they were doing, that the decisions being made were sound. I didn't tell them what I'd overheard because I didn't want to put them in the position of knowing. But I watched them work overtime on inadequate solutions, watched them trust the system, and felt sick knowing they had no idea we were all part of a gamble with catastrophic stakes. Every time I felt the ship's vibration pattern change, every unusual sound from the engine room, my heart would race, thinking this was it. This was the shaft failing. I ran scenarios in my head constantly. Where would I be when it happened? Could I get to a muster station? Would there be enough time to evacuate 4,000 people? I stopped sleeping properly, just laid in my cabin calculating survival odds and imagining the aftermath. On day 6, 30 hours before we were scheduled to return to port, the crack had grown to nearly 8 millimeters at its widest point. The shaft was producing vibrations that passengers had started commenting about, complaints that the hotel director had to field. Thomas called another emergency meeting, this time including me and the other monitoring engineers. He made it very clear that if anyone discussed the shaft issue with non-engineering personnel, it would be considered breach of confidentiality and grounds for immediate termination. He characterized what we were doing as managing a developing situation with appropriate technical responses, making it sound reasonable, professional, as if we weren't knowingly operating a damaged ship. Then he looked directly at me and said he'd noticed I'd been taking extensive documentation. He said he appreciated my thoroughness, but reminded me that all engineering documentation was company property and shouldn't be shared outside proper channels. The threat was implicit but unmistakable. He knew I'd been collecting evidence, and he was warning me that using it would have consequences. I nodded and said I understood, keeping my face neutral while internally panicking about whether my encrypted backups were actually secure. We made it back to port. The shaft held for those final 30 hours, and the Pacific Horizon docked on schedule without incident. Passengers disembarked talking about their wonderful cruise, completely unaware that they'd spent 4 days on a ship with a critical structural failure that had a documented 15% chance of catastrophic consequences. The moment we docked, the shipyard crew swarmed the engine room. The propulsion shaft was replaced within 48 hours, before the next cruise embarked. The official maintenance log listed it as routine replacement during scheduled maintenance. No mention of the crack, the emergency meetings, the calculated risk. I submitted my resignation the day after we docked. My contract had 3 months remaining, but I told HR I had a family emergency that required immediate return home. They processed my early termination with barely any questions, probably happy to remove someone who documented things they'd prefer stayed undocumented. Thomas didn't try to stop me, didn't even say goodbye. He just signed my discharge papers and told me I'd had a promising career, emphasis on had, making sure I understood what speaking out would cost me. I kept all my documentation. For weeks after leaving, I wrestled with what to do with it. Report it to maritime safety authorities and probably get dismissed as a disgruntled ex-employee. Go to media and definitely get sued into oblivion by the cruise line's legal team. Or keep quiet and live with knowing I'd witnessed something dangerous and done nothing to prevent it from happening again. I still have those files, backed up in multiple locations, a record of decisions that should horrify anyone who trusts cruise ship safety systems. I work for a land-based engineering firm now, designing systems that don't float and don't carry thousands of lives through international waters where accountability gets murky. I tell people I left cruise ships because I missed being home, and technically that's true. But the real reason is that I learned something about institutional corruption that I can't unknow. When profit margins conflict with safety protocols, when keeping to schedule matters more than structural integrity, the people making decisions will choose money every single time. And they'll find ways to make those choices sound reasonable, to frame calculated risks as professional judgment, to silence anyone who questions them. Sometimes I search news sites for reports of cruise ship mechanical failures, dreading the day I'll see the Pacific Horizon's name attached to a disaster that could have been prevented. So far, nothing. Maybe they've improved their inspection protocols. Maybe that shaft replacement scared them into better practices. Or maybe they're still calculating acceptable risks with other people's lives, still pressuring junior engineers to stay quiet, still prioritizing quarterly earnings over the possibility of catastrophic failure. I don't know, and that uncertainty keeps me awake some nights. What I do know is that maritime safety is only as good as the people willing to enforce it. And when those people decide profit matters more than protocols, all the regulations in the world won't save anyone. That's the truth they don't want passengers to know, the reality behind the safety demonstrations and emergency procedures. Sometimes the biggest threat isn't mechanical failure. It's the human decision to ignore it. My name is Ozzy, and I need to confess something that's going to make you think twice about trusting your cruise ship bartender. For 7 years, I've been running what I call the greatest psychology experiment never published in any academic journal. The main atrium bar on the Sapphire Seas isn't just a place where passengers get drinks. It's my laboratory, and every single person who sits at my bar becomes an unknowing participant in behavioral experiments that range from harmlessly amusing to morally questionable. The best part? They pay premium prices for the privilege of being manipulated, and they usually thank me with generous tips while I'm doing it. Let me start by explaining something about cruise ship bartenders that passengers never realize. We see you at your worst and most vulnerable. You're on vacation, inhibitions lowered, spending money you've already mentally written off as cruise budget. Surrounded by strangers you'll never see again. You tell us things you wouldn't tell your therapist. You make decisions you'd never make at home. And we, the bartenders, we learn to read people so accurately, it's almost supernatural. After 7 years behind this bar, I can predict your entire evening within 5 minutes of meeting you. And once I can predict you, I can influence you. That's where the real fun begins. The game started during my second contract. Me and 3 other bartenders were working a slow afternoon shift, and we got bored. Someone suggested we try predicting how the evening crowd would behave based on first impressions. Who'd get sloppy drunk? Who'd start crying about their marriage? Who'd try to start fights? Who'd end up making out with a stranger by midnight? We started keeping score, and we got disturbingly good at it. The divorced guy ordering whiskey neat at 4 p.m., he'll be crying by 8 p.m. and hitting on someone inappropriately by 10 p.m. The bachelorette party ordering colorful shots. 2 of them will have drama by 9 p.m., someone will vomit by 11 p.m., and they'll all be best friends again by 1 a.m. The older couple nursing martinis while barely speaking. They'll either have a massive argument or renew their vows by week's end, no middle ground. But prediction got boring after a while. The real entertainment came from manipulation, from seeing if we could influence outcomes, create scenarios, essentially play puppet master with human behavior. And before you judge me too harshly, understand that we never did anything truly harmful. We just nudged people in directions they were already heading and watched what happened. Think of it as accelerated social dynamics. Entertainment value for us, memorable vacation stories for them. Everyone wins, kind of. One of our favorite techniques was strategic seating. The bar had a U-shaped configuration, and we controlled who sat where. When we spotted two people who we knew would either hit it off spectacularly or create amazing drama, we'd manipulate the seating to put them next to each other. The method was simple. Tell one person, "Oh, that seat has a wobbly stool, sit here instead." Or casually mention, "Best view of the entertainment is from this section." Within minutes, we'd have our targets positioned exactly where we wanted them. Then we'd watch the show unfold while serving drinks and taking mental notes. I once seated a loud Texan who wouldn't stop talking about his oil business next to an environmental activist from Portland who had very strong opinions about fossil fuels. They argued for 3 hours straight, buying round after round because neither would back down, each trying to drink the other under the table while winning the political debate. Best sales night that week, and the entertainment was priceless. They actually exchanged emails at the end, either to continue the argument or because they developed some weird mutual respect. Either way, I orchestrated that entire interaction based on reading their personalities in under 2 minutes. The drink manipulation was more subtle but equally effective. We had a whole system for managing problematic passengers without ever having to cut them off officially. See, cutting someone off creates confrontation, complaints, potential bad reviews. But if you just gradually water down their drinks, they keep ordering, keep paying full price, but they plateau at a manageable level of intoxication. We called it the leveling technique. The trick is doing it so gradually they don't notice. Start with a full pour, then 80%, then 60%. Until you're basically serving them expensive juice with a whisper of alcohol. They feel like they're keeping pace with their drinking buddies. We avoid the liability of overserving, and we still collect full-price payments for watered-down drinks. Ethically questionable, absolutely, but also incredibly effective at preventing the kind of incidents that create actual problems. Then there's the pricing psychology, which is where things get really manipulative. We had this technique called anchoring, where we'd strategically place extremely overpriced specialty cocktails on the menu, stuff that cost $40 or $50 that nobody actually ordered. But having them there made the $30 cocktails seem reasonable by comparison. We'd also do this thing where we'd recommend the mid-priced options, playing up their value, making passengers feel smart for not ordering the cheapest drink, but also not being the sucker who bought the $50 one. The genius is that the $30 drink cost us maybe $4 in ingredients, but passengers felt like they were making a savvy choice. Music selection was another tool in the manipulation toolkit. We controlled the playlist in the bar area, and we learned exactly how different music affected spending and behavior. Upbeat pop music made people drink faster and order more rounds. Slower jazz or acoustic made them linger longer and order premium drinks. If we wanted to clear the bar, because we were exhausted and wanted to end our shift, we'd switch to something slightly annoying, just enough to make people unconsciously decide to move somewhere else. If we wanted to create romantic atmosphere because we'd identified some lonely singles we thought would make an entertaining match, we'd cue up the mood lighting and put on some strategically selected ballads. Which brings me to the matchmaking. This started as harmless fun, identifying lonely passengers and subtly encouraging connections. We'd mention to a solo traveler that another solo traveler had similar interests, or we'd create situations where they'd naturally start conversations. Most of the time, nothing came of it. But occasionally, we'd hit gold. People would connect, have vacation romances, thank us for the introduction. It felt like doing a good deed while also creating entertainment for ourselves. We even kept a success rate chart behind the bar, tracking which bartender had the best matchmaking record. But here's where I have to admit that sometimes The manipulation went too far. Crossed lines I didn't even realize I was crossing until it was too late. There was this guy named Philip who'd been coming to my bar every evening for 6 days straight. Mid-40s, recently divorced based on the stories he told, clearly lonely and trying to figure out his new single life. He was a nice guy, decent tipper, but painfully awkward around women. And there was this woman, Sarah, similar age, also recently divorced. Also spending lots of time at the bar because she was traveling alone and didn't know what else to do. In my head, I was being a good guy by orchestrating their meeting. I seated them next to each other, started conversations that pulled them both in, made sure their drinks were perfectly timed so they'd be ordering simultaneously. I played music I knew they'd both mentioned liking. I essentially created the perfect conditions for connection. And it worked. They hit it off immediately, spent the next 2 days inseparable, and by the final night of the cruise, Philip was planning to propose. That's when I realized I'd gone too far. This wasn't a vacation romance anymore. This was a guy about to make a major life decision based on a relationship I'd artificially engineered in a controlled environment that had nothing to do with real life. I'd manipulated two vulnerable people into a connection that felt organic to them, but was actually orchestrated by a bartender who thought he was playing a harmless game. The guilt hit me like a physical weight. What if they got married based on this cruise ship meeting I'd manufactured? What if it fell apart and ruined them both? What if I'd just treated human emotions like they were pieces in a game? I tried to subtly discourage Philip from proposing. Mentioned that cruise ship romances often don't translate to real life. Suggested maybe exchanging information and seeing how things went once they were both home. But he was determined, said he'd never felt this way before. That meeting Sarah was fate. He proposed on the final night, right there at my bar. And she said yes. I smiled and congratulated them and mixed them celebratory drinks. And the entire time I felt sick because I knew the truth. It wasn't fate. It was me, playing God with other people's lives because I was bored and thought human behavior was entertaining. I don't know what happened to them. Maybe they're happily married now. Maybe it fell apart the moment they got off the ship. Maybe they figured out that the connection they felt was partly manufactured by environmental manipulation and calculated social engineering. I'll never know. And that uncertainty haunts me more than I'd like to admit. Because it forced me to confront something I'd been avoiding. All the passenger behavior prediction, the strategic seating, the drink manipulation, the matchmaking, all of it was treating people like they were entertainment rather than humans with actual emotions and consequences. Don't get me wrong, I still do most of it. The prediction game, the pricing psychology, the strategic seating for entertaining conversations. That's just part of being a good bartender, reading the room and creating atmosphere. But I stopped to the matchmaking. I stopped manipulating lonely people into connections because I decided their vulnerability was entertaining. That crossed a line from morally gray into actually harmful, and the Philip and Sarah situation taught me where my ethical boundaries should be, even if I'd been ignoring them for years. Here's what passengers need to understand about cruise ship bartenders, especially the charismatic ones who seem like they're your instant best friend. We're performers, and you're the audience. Everything from our personality to our recommendations to the atmosphere we create is calculated. We know you're on vacation. We know you're in a spending mood. We know you're looking for connection and entertainment. And we use all of that knowledge to maximize tips, create amusing situations, and generally treat the bar like it's our personal social experiment. Most of the time, it's harmless. Sometimes it's even genuinely helpful. But occasionally, it crosses into manipulation that affects real lives in ways we don't think about until it's too late. I'm 34 now, still working the same bar on the sapphire seas, still reading passengers like they're open books, still playing some of the same psychological games. But I'm more aware now of the line between entertainment and exploitation, between reading people and manipulating them. I catch myself sometimes about to orchestrate some situation, and I have to ask whether I'm doing it because it's actually helpful or just because I think the outcome will be entertaining to watch. Usually I can't honestly answer that question, which probably says everything about the ethical gray zone I operate in. The truth is, every good bartender does some version of what I do. We read people. We influence behavior. We create atmosphere that encourages certain outcomes. The difference is, most bartenders probably don't think of it as a psychology experiment. Don't keep score. Don't consciously manipulate situations just to see what happens. Or maybe they do and just don't admit it. Maybe every service industry worker who deals with drunk people eventually starts seeing them as entertainment, as subjects in an ongoing study of human behavior at its most vulnerable and uninhibited. Maybe I'm just honest enough to admit what everyone else denies. That's what I tell myself anyway, when the guilt about Philip and Sarah keeps me awake at night. I was just doing what bartenders do. I just did it more consciously, more deliberately, and sometimes with less regard for the human cost. That's the confession nobody wants from their friendly cruise ship bartender. But it's the truth. And after 7 years of manipulating passengers for entertainment and profit, I figured someone should probably say it out loud. My name is Sophia, and I keep photographs of moments that were never meant to be remembered. For 5 years, I've worked as the portrait and event photographer on the Ocean Majesty, capturing smiles and celebrations and carefully posed family portraits that passengers purchase as souvenirs of their perfect vacations. But hidden in an encrypted folder on 3 separate hard drives, I maintain a collection of images I was supposed to delete. Pictures of the real cruise ship experience, the one nobody wants to acknowledge exists. The last moments before marriages ended, the final photographs of people who didn't survive the voyage, the expressions of grief and loss and desperation that happen on ships where everyone's supposed to be having the time of their lives. I can't explain exactly why I keep these images, only that deleting them felt like erasing proof that these moments mattered, that these people's pain was real. Photography chose me young. I was 17 when I realized I saw the world differently through a camera lens, noticed details other people missed, found beauty and truth in unexpected moments. By 23, I'd completed art school and was struggling to make a living doing the kind of documentary photography I cared about. The cruise ship job was supposed to be temporary, a way to save money while traveling. 5 years have passed since then, and I'm still here, still taking the same posed family portraits against the same artificial backdrops, still selling the same fantasy of perfect vacation memories. The official job is simple. I work formal nights, capturing elegant couples in their finest clothes. I photograph kids' activities, families at dinner, passengers at various ship locations with scenic backgrounds. Every image is carefully composed to show happiness, togetherness, vacation magic. We use specific poses that minimize flaws and maximize marketability. Passengers browse the photo galleries daily, purchasing prints of themselves looking more glamorous and joyful than they probably feel. It's manufactured memory, professionally lit and expertly edited. And it pays my bills while slowly killing whatever artistic integrity I thought I had. But cameras capture everything, not just what we intend. Between the scheduled portrait sessions and event coverage, I see things through my viewfinder that tell different stories. And somewhere during my 2nd year, I stopped deleting those images. I started keeping them building what I privately call my truth collection. Photos that show what cruise ships are really like when you look beyond the marketing fantasy. The collection started with an image I took by accident. I was photographing a formal night session, and a couple ahead of me in the schedule was having a vicious argument near the photo area. They didn't realize I could see them, hidden partially by equipment. The woman was crying, mascara ruining her carefully applied makeup, and the man was gesturing angrily, his face twisted in contempt. Something about that moment, the raw emotion happening 10 feet from where other couples were posing for romantic portraits, struck me as profoundly true. Without really thinking about it, I raised my camera and captured it. One image, taken through a gap in the equipment, showing real emotion in an environment designed to manufacture false ones. I should have deleted it immediately. It violated every privacy and ethical guideline. But when I reviewed it later, alone in my cabin, I couldn't. The photograph was more honest than anything I'd taken professionally in months. It showed what was actually happening on this ship, not the fantasy we were selling. So I moved it to a private folder, separate from work files, and told myself it was a one-time thing, an artistic impulse I wouldn't repeat. Except I did repeat it, again and again, for 5 years. Anytime I witnessed something real, something that contradicted the carefully manufactured vacation narrative, I documented it. A teenage girl crying alone on a deck, surrounded by party decorations from some celebration she'd fled. An elderly man standing at the rail at sunrise, his expression so devastated, I knew instinctively he'd just received terrible news from home. A family staged for a portrait, everyone smiling for the camera while you could see the tension and resentment in their body language. The space between them revealing disconnection no amount of professional posing could hide. Some images in my collection are more haunting than others. There's a photograph of a couple, probably in their 60s, standing on their balcony. I took it from a distance during golden hour, when the light was perfect. They're not looking at each other, and even from that distance, you can see the body language of a relationship that's died. I found out later they were on their final cruise together before finalizing their divorce. That photograph captured the last moments of a 40-year marriage, and they have no idea it exists. There's an image of a child, maybe 8 years old, at the kids' club party I was covering. She's wearing a princess costume and a bright smile, posing with the ship's mascot character. Standard cute kid photo, the kind parents love. Except I'd been photographing the party for 20 minutes, and I'd watched this child go from genuinely joyful to increasingly exhausted. Watched her smile become forced as she tried to maintain energy she didn't have. Later, I learned she was sick, some condition her parents hadn't disclosed. And this cruise was a final family trip before treatment that had uncertain outcomes. That photograph shows a child performing happiness while dealing with things no 8-year-old should face. Her parents bought multiple copies, wanting to remember her joy. I kept the raw file because it showed something more complicated than joy. It showed bravery and exhaustion, and childhood interrupted. The darkest image in my collection, the one I've come closest to deleting countless times, was taken completely by accident. I was photographing a deck party, moving through the crowd, capturing candid moments. In the background of one shot, barely visible through the crowd, is a man climbing over a railing. I didn't see it when I took the photo, didn't process what was happening until hours later when I was reviewing the day's files. By then, I knew there'd been a man-overboard situation during the party, that someone had jumped, that he didn't survive. And buried in my party coverage was what's probably his last moment alive. captured accidentally while I was photographing someone's vacation dance. I should have turned that photo over to investigators. It might have provided information about what happened, might have helped his family understand. But I didn't. I kept it in my encrypted collection, this documentation of a death that happened while everyone around him partied, oblivious. Sometimes I study that image, trying to understand what I'm looking at. Is it a person making a final decision? Evidence of a tragedy? Or just accidental documentation that I've assigned meaning to after the fact? I honestly don't know. And that uncertainty is part of why I can't delete it. People assume photographers just capture what's there, that we're passive observers recording reality. But that's not how it works. Every photograph involves choices. What to frame, what to exclude, when to press the shutter, how to compose the image. And increasingly, I found myself making the choice to document pain, to capture moments of authentic emotion even when those moments were private, were none of my business, violated trust. I justified it by calling it art, by telling myself I was bearing witness to truth that mattered. But was I? Or was I just exploiting vulnerable people's worst moments for my own purposes? The question haunts me every time I add an image to the collection. During my 4th year, I photographed Formal Night and recognized a couple I'd photographed the previous year. They'd been affectionate then, newly married energy, couldn't stop touching each other. This year they barely spoke. They posed for the portrait because they'd paid for it. But the warmth was gone, replaced by the kind of polite distance that signals a relationship's end. I took the required posed shot, and then, after they left, I pulled up last year's image of them. The difference was devastating. Same people, same formal wear, same posed position. Completely different emotional reality. I saved both images side by side in my collection, this before and after documentation of love dying. Is that art or voyeurism? Am I documenting important emotional truth or just being creepy? The line feels impossibly blurred. Some days I think I'm creating important work that shows the reality behind cruise ship fantasy, that future viewers might see these images and understand something true about human experience. Other days I think I'm just a person with a camera exploiting others' pain because it makes me feel artistically relevant. Both things can be true simultaneously, and that moral ambiguity is something I've learned to live with, even though it never gets comfortable. The technical aspect of maintaining the collection is its own burden. 3 separate encrypted hard drives, hidden in different locations, backed up obsessively, because losing them would feel like losing evidence that these moments happened. I've spent hours organizing them, creating metadata, writing notes about circumstances and context, treating them like a serious archive rather than what they might actually be. Stolen moments from people who never consented to being photographed at their most vulnerable. Nobody knows about the collection. Not my roommate, not my family. Certainly not my employers who'd fire me immediately if they discovered I was keeping unpurchased images, especially ones taken without consent. The secret has weight, sits on my chest some nights when I can't sleep. But the idea of deleting them, of destroying these images, feels worse. Like I'd be erasing proof that these people's pain existed, that real emotion happened in these curated fantasy spaces. There's a photo I took last month that made me question everything about what I'm doing. A woman in her 70s, traveling alone, sitting in the main theater watching a show. Everyone around her is laughing, entertained, having the time of their lives. And she's sitting there crying silently, tears running down her face while she stares at the stage without seeing it. I was covering the show, taking wide crowd shots, and I saw her through my lens. I should have turned the camera away, given her privacy and her grief. Instead, I zoomed in and captured it. One image of pure, unguarded sadness in a room full of manufactured joy. I printed that photograph, which I never do with collection images, hung it in my cabin where I see it every day. Some kind of penance, maybe, or reminder or question I'm forcing myself to confront. That woman's grief isn't my art. It's not my story to tell. She didn't consent to being photographed, would be horrified to know that moment was captured and kept. And yet the image is undeniably powerful. Says something true about loneliness and the performance of vacation happiness and how grief follows us even to places designed to escape it. So here's my confession. The question I can't answer after 5 years of maintaining this collection. Am I bearing witness to important truths that the cruise industry wants to hide? Or am I just a voyeur with a camera, exploiting vulnerable people's authentic moments for my own artistic pretensions? Maybe there's no difference. Maybe all documentary photography exists in that morally gray space between observation and exploitation. But knowing that doesn't make me feel better about the encrypted drives hidden in my cabin, full of other people's pain that I've cataloged and preserved without their permission. The thought of quitting comes constantly. Getting off this ship, finding real photography work on land, maybe even deleting the collection and freeing myself from the weight of keeping these secrets. But something holds me back each time. I keep taking the posed portraits and manufactured memories that pay my salary. And I keep adding to my truth collection, documenting the reality underneath the fantasy, capturing moments I have no right to possess. Maybe someday I'll figure out if what I'm doing matters, if there's actual artistic or documentary value in these stolen images. Or maybe I'll just keep carrying the weight of other people's documented pain, this archive of moments that were never meant to be preserved, held by someone who can't quite justify keeping them, but also can't bring herself to let them go. That's what 5 years as a cruise ship photographer has taught me. That the gap between art and exploitation is sometimes impossible to measure. And that witnessing other people's authentic pain doesn't become noble just because you frame it well and call it truth. But I keep doing it anyway. Keep pressing the shutter at moments I shouldn't. Keep building this collection that might be important documentation or might just be evidence of my own ethical failures. I honestly don't know which. And that uncertainty has become the story I'm actually documenting. Not their pain, but my inability to look away from it. Each photograph I add to the collection is another moment I chose observation over ethics. Another instance where I prioritized capturing truth over respecting privacy. And each night when I back up those encrypted drives, I'm making the choice again to keep these secrets, to maintain this archive of other people's worst moments. The contract I signed runs another 7 months. 7 more months of formal night portraits and kids' parties and deck celebrations. 7 more months of watching real emotion happen in the margins of manufactured happiness. 7 more months of deciding, over and over, whether to raise my camera or look away, whether to document or delete, whether to bear witness or respect privacy. So far, I've chosen documentation every time. Chosen to keep building this collection that exists somewhere between art project and ethical violation. Maybe by the end of this contract, I'll have clarity about which it really is. Or maybe I'll just have more encrypted images, more stolen moments, more proof that I can't answer the fundamental question at the heart of what I do. When does observation become exploitation? When does documentation become violation? And who gets to decide where that line is when the people being photographed never consented to being subjects in the first place? Those questions follow me through every shift, through every image I capture and choose to keep. But the questions don't stop me from pressing the shutter. from adding to the collection, from carrying this weight that gets heavier with each photo, but somehow never heavy enough to make me stop. My name is Miguel, and I watched someone get murdered. I need to say it that directly because for 2 years, I've been calling it an accident, using the company's language, repeating the official story. But what happened to Jules on the Coral Paradise wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable conclusion of weeks of harassment and violence that everyone saw coming and nobody stopped. Including me. Especially me. Because I was there that night. I heard things, I knew things, and when the company offered me the choice between truth and my job, I chose to keep working. That decision haunts me every single day. But what haunts me more is knowing that crew deaths don't matter the same way passenger deaths do. We're expendable. We're replaceable. And when one of us goes overboard, the investigation is just theater designed to protect the company, not find the truth. The Coral Paradise had a crew of about 1,100 people from 43 countries, all of us crammed into below-deck quarters that passengers never see. Small cabins with bunk beds, shared bathrooms, narrow corridors where you're constantly bumping into people. The hierarchy is strict and territorial. Senior crew members get better cabins, better schedules, better treatment. Junior crew, especially those in their first or second contracts, they get the worst of everything, and they're expected to absorb it without complaint because that's how the system works. You pay your dues, you move up. You eventually become the senior crew member making someone else's life difficult. It's a cycle that perpetuates abuse, because everyone who survived it thinks the next generation should suffer the same way. Jules was 23, from Romania, working his first contract as part of the deck maintenance crew. Small guy, maybe 5'6", quiet, kept to himself mostly. He'd been assigned to the same maintenance team as 3 senior crew members who'd been on ships for years and had developed this pack mentality where they controlled their territory and made life hell for anyone who didn't fit their group. The leader was a guy named Andrei, also Romanian ironically, who seemed to take particular pleasure in tormenting Jules. Started small, hiding his tools so he'd get in trouble for not having equipment, assigning him the worst tasks, making jokes about his size, his inexperience, his accent, even though they shared the same background. But it escalated. By the 3rd week, it had become physical. Shoving Jules in corridors, accidentally knocking into him during work, tripping him on stairs. I witnessed most of it because my cabin was near theirs, and because deck crew often worked overlapping areas. Every time I saw it happen, I told myself it wasn't my business, that Jules needed to stand up for himself, that intervening would just make me a target too. Classic bystander rationalization. I was 36 years old, on my 5th contract, and I chose self-preservation over helping someone who clearly needed it. Other crew members saw it too. Everyone knew what was happening. In the crew mess, in the corridors, during shift changes, Jules was being systematically harassed, and the unspoken rule was to stay out of it. Crew politics are complicated. You get involved in someone else's conflict, you risk your own position, your relationships, your ability to work peacefully. So we all watched it happen, made sympathetic faces when Jules wasn't looking, and told ourselves that he'd figure it out or transfer to a different department or finish his contract and leave. Nobody wanted to acknowledge that harassment like that doesn't just stop on its own. It escalates until something breaks. The night it happened was a Tuesday, end of a port day. Ship had departed around 6 p.m. and was heading to the next destination. I'd finished my shift at 10 p.m. and was heading to my cabin when I heard shouting from the crew deck area. This was a restricted section, open-air deck space that crew used for breaks, because it was away from passenger areas. I recognized Andre's voice immediately, along with his two friends. They were yelling at someone, and I knew without seeing that it was Jules. I should have gone to investigate, should have called security, should have done anything except what I actually did, which was walk faster to my cabin and close the door. 20 minutes later, the alarm went off. Crew member overboard. Everyone who's worked ships knows that sound. The way it cuts through everything else, the immediate dread. Within minutes, the crew communication system was buzzing with information. Someone from deck maintenance crew fell from crew deck area. Search operations initiated. I knew before they announced the name. I knew because I'd heard the confrontation 20 minutes earlier and chosen to walk away. When they confirmed it was Jules, I felt my stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with the ship's movement. The search lasted 6 hours. They found his body 3 hours in, floating in the ship's wake, injuries consistent with impact from the fall. The official timeline said he'd gone overboard around 10:30 p.m. I'd heard the shouting at 10:15 p.m. 15 minutes before Jules went over the rail, he'd been in a confrontation with crew members who'd been harassing him for weeks. But when security interviewed me the next morning, asking if I'd seen or heard anything unusual, I hesitated just long enough to doom whatever integrity I had left. I told them I'd heard voices, but couldn't identify who or what was said. I didn't mention Andre. I didn't mention the weeks of escalating harassment. I protected myself and condemned Jules to being just another accident statistic. The internal investigation was a joke, and everyone knew it. 2 company security officers interviewed crew members for about 3 days, asking surface-level questions that felt designed to confirm the predetermined conclusion rather than find truth. Andre and his friends claimed they'd been in the crew mess at the time, had witnesses who backed them up. The witnesses were other senior crew members who understood the code. You protect your own. You don't create problems. You tell the story that keeps everyone working. The security officers accepted these statements without much push, filed their reports, and within a week, the official conclusion was released. Accidental death. Jules had been on the crew deck alone, leaning over the rail, lost his balance and fell. No evidence of foul play. Case closed. Except it wasn't accidental, and everyone involved knew it. The crew quarters were thick with rumors. Some people said they'd seen Jules with a black eye the day before. Others claimed Andre had been bragging about teaching him a lesson. Someone heard that there had been a fight, that Jules had been pushed, that multiple crew members had witnessed it, but were too scared to come forward. None of these rumors made it into official reports. The company didn't want to investigate crew-on-crew violence because that would mean admitting their crew management systems were failing, would mean liability and potential criminal charges and terrible publicity. What happens when you're the crew member who knows things but stays silent? The company identifies you quickly. Within days of the official report, I was called to a meeting with the Human Resources Director and a representative from corporate. They didn't threaten me directly, were too smart for that. Instead, they explained how important it was for crew morale that we move past this tragedy, how spreading rumors or contradicting the official investigation would only hurt Jules's family and cause unnecessary pain. They reminded me that my contract was up for renewal in 6 weeks, that my performance reviews had been excellent, that I had a good future with the company if I continued to demonstrate good judgment and loyalty. Then they presented me with a statement to sign. It said I'd been interviewed as part of the investigation, that I had no information contradicting the official findings, that I supported the conclusion of accidental death. I read it 3 times. This document that would make me complicit in covering up what had actually happened. The HR director watched me, patient and professional, and I knew what my options were. sign and keep my job. Keep sending money home to my family in Mexico, keep the career I'd built over 5 contracts. Or refuse and become a problem they'd solve by terminating my contract, blacklisting me from cruise work, leaving me without income or prospects. They didn't have to say it explicitly. The choice was clear. I signed. I put my name on a document I knew was false, and I became part of the system that values company reputation over crew member lives. The shame of that moment hasn't faded in 2 years. Every time I think about it, I feel sick. But I also kept working, kept taking my salary, kept benefiting from the choice I made to prioritize my own survival over truth. That's what makes it so complicated. I'm not just a victim of corporate pressure. I'm a participant in the cover-up. Someone who chose complicity when I could have chosen honesty, even if honesty would have cost me everything. Andre and his friends were transferred to a different ship 3 weeks later. Not as punishment, but as routine reassignment. They're still working for the company, still probably harassing junior crew members, still operating within a system that protects senior staff and treats new workers as expendable. Jules's family received his final paycheck and a condolence letter explaining that their son had died in a tragic accident. They were never told about the harassment, the escalating violence, the confrontation 15 minutes before he went overboard. They were given the sanitized version designed to minimize company liability. The guilt I carry isn't the poetic, redemptive kind you see in movies. It's the mundane, grinding realization that I'm a coward who chose money over morality and has to live with that knowledge every day. I see Jules's face sometimes when I'm working the same deck areas he used to maintain. I wonder what he was thinking in those final moments. Whether he knew nobody was coming to help him. Whether he'd realized that the harassment would never stop until someone intervened, and nobody was going to intervene. I wonder if he blamed us, the crew members who watched it happen and did nothing. I hope he didn't. I hope he just thought we were scared, which is true, even if it's not an excuse. Here's what passengers don't understand about cruise ships. When something happens to one of you, the response is immediate and comprehensive. Medical teams, investigations, family notifications, everything by the book, because passenger safety is the brand's reputation. But when something happens to crew, we're from developing countries with families who need the income we send home. We're replaceable. We're not the customers. Our deaths get quietly filed under unfortunate accidents, and the company moves on within days because stopping operations to properly investigate costs money. There's an unspoken rule on ships that crew members understand, but passengers never see. We protect each other in ways that matter. The small daily kindnesses that make this difficult life bearable. But when it comes to challenging authority, to standing up against senior crew or management, to risking our jobs for principle, we stay silent. Because most of us are sending money home to families who depend on us, supporting parents or children or siblings who would suffer if we lost these positions. The company knows this. They know we can't afford to be heroes, can't afford to choose truth over employment. And they use that knowledge to ensure compliance, to make sure investigations reach the conclusions they want, to protect their reputation at the expense of crew members who no longer have voices. 2 years after Jules went overboard, I'm still working ships, still part of the deck maintenance crew, still seeing new junior workers arrive who remind me of him. Sometimes I want to warn them about how things really work, about the hierarchies and the harassment and the fact that nobody will protect them if things go wrong. But warning them would mean admitting my own complicity, acknowledging out loud that I watched someone get driven to death and did nothing to stop it. So I stay quiet, same as I've been staying quiet. perpetuating the same cycle that killed Jules. The worst part isn't the guilt, though that's constant and heavy. The worst part is knowing that what happened to Jules could happen again tomorrow, and the response would be exactly the same. Another investigation designed to reach predetermined conclusions. Another family receiving condolence letters and sanitized explanations. Another crew member like me witnessing things and choosing silence because speaking up costs too much. The system that failed Jules hasn't changed because the system isn't broken from the company's perspective. It's working exactly as designed. Protecting corporate interests, minimizing liability, treating crew members as replaceable units rather than people with lives that matter. I think about quitting every time my contract comes up for renewal. Getting off ships, finding land-based work, escaping the environment that forced me to choose between morality and survival. But then I think about my family depending on the money I send home, about starting over at 37 with limited options, about how leaving wouldn't bring Jules back or change what I did. So I sign another contract, return to the same ship, walk past the crew deck where it happened, and carry the knowledge that I'm complicit in his death, even if I wasn't there when he went over the rail. Because I was there for weeks before, watching the harassment, doing nothing. And I was there after, signing statements I knew were false, choosing to protect the system instead of demanding truth. That's the confession nobody wants from crew members. Not that accidents happen, but that sometimes they're not accidents at all. That crew-on-crew violence is real and often ignored. That investigations are frequently predetermined. That company loyalty is enforced through economic pressure. That people like me witness terrible things and stay silent because speaking up means losing everything. Jules died because of harassment that escalated into violence. And he died alone because a system designed to protect profits rather than people decided his death was more convenient as an accident than as evidence of institutional failure. And I'm still here, still working, still carrying the weight of knowing I could have made different choices, but didn't. That's the reality of crew life that passengers never see. The darkness underneath the service smiles and manufactured hospitality. Sometimes the biggest danger on these ships isn't the ocean. It's the human systems that decide some lives matter less than corporate reputation, and the people like me who go along with it because we're too scared or too selfish to do otherwise. My name is Chen, and I helped poison 473 people. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but through silence and obedience, and the kind of institutional cowardice that lets disasters happen while everyone involved pretends they couldn't have stopped it. I was a sous chef in the main galley of the Pacific Dream, responsible for overseeing meal preparation for 3,000 passengers. And I knew the food we were serving was contaminated. I reported it through proper channels, got threatened into silence, and then watched as hundreds of people got sick from meals I helped prepare. The cruise line blamed passengers for bringing illness aboard. The media repeated that story. And I kept my job by keeping my mouth shut about what actually happened in the kitchens during those 72 hours when management decided profit mattered more than food safety. I'd been working cruise ships for 6 years, trained at culinary school in Shanghai, worked my way up from prep cook to sous chef through obsessive attention to detail and perfectionism about food safety. Kitchens are dangerous places where small mistakes can sicken hundreds of people. Cross-contamination, improper temperatures, unwashed surfaces. Any of these can turn a meal into a health crisis. That's why professional kitchens have protocols, why health inspections matter, why there are rules about sick workers and food storage and temperature monitoring. Except those rules only work if management allows them to be enforced. And on cruise ships, where keeping to schedule means everything, Food safety becomes negotiable when it conflicts with operations. The problem started on embarkation day, the busiest day of any cruise, when 3,000 new passengers board and expect their first meals within hours. I arrived for my shift at 5 a.m. to prep for lunch service, and immediately noticed that 3 of the line cooks looked terrible. Pale, sweating, one of them kept running to the bathroom. I asked if they were sick, and they admitted they'd been vomiting since the night before, but were told they had to work because we were short-staffed for embarkation. They were preparing food, cutting vegetables, handling proteins, plating dishes, while actively ill with what was obviously some kind of stomach virus. I went directly to the head chef, a French guy named Guillaume, who'd been running cruise ship kitchens for 20 years. I told him we had sick workers handling food, that we needed to send them to medical and get replacements. He looked at me like I'd suggested we cancel the cruise. He explained that embarkation day was critical, that we had no replacement staff available, that the workers had been instructed to wear gloves and wash hands frequently. When I insisted that gloves and hand washing weren't sufficient when someone was actively vomiting, that we were risking contamination and outbreak, he got very quiet and very cold. He told me that if I wanted to keep my position, I needed to understand that operational reality sometimes required flexibility. He said good sous chefs knew when to work within the system rather than create problems. The threat was implicit but clear. Drop it or face consequences. So I dropped it. Told myself that maybe Guillaume was right, that maybe the protocols of gloves and hand washing would be sufficient. I supervised those sick workers throughout lunch service, watched them prepare meals while periodically running to vomit, and I said nothing further. That was my first failure. Not the biggest one, but the moment when I chose to prioritize my career over my professional standards. The second failure came that night. I was doing the midnight inventory check, routine inspection of storage areas and refrigeration units, when I noticed that walk-in Unit 3 felt warmer than it should. I checked the temperature gauge and felt my stomach drop. The unit was reading 53 degrees Fahrenheit. Industrial refrigeration for food storage needs to maintain below 40 degrees. Anything above that for extended periods means bacterial growth, spoilage, contamination. I checked the maintenance log and discovered that the unit had malfunctioned around 8 p.m., had been running at elevated temperatures for over 4 hours before being noticed. The unit contained hundreds of pounds of prepared foods, sauces, pre-cooked proteins, dairy products, cut vegetables. All of it sitting at temperatures that allowed bacterial proliferation for hours. Protocol was unambiguous. Compromised refrigeration for that duration meant everything in that unit needed to be discarded. You don't take chances with food that's been sitting at unsafe temperatures. But we're talking about enough food to prepare meals for thousands of people, representing tens of thousands of dollars in inventory. And discarding it would mean running short on tomorrow's menu, having to make substitutions, potentially disappointing passengers who'd been promised specific dishes. I knew what protocol required, but I also knew what the decision-makers would choose. Guillaume was called down at 12:30 a.m. to assess the situation. He checked the unit, reviewed the temperature logs, and I watched him calculate the cost-benefit analysis in real time. Then he made the decision that would sicken hundreds of people. He said the food was fine, that 4 hours wasn't long enough to cause problems, that we'd incorporate it into tomorrow's service, and nobody would know the difference. When I objected, cited food safety regulations, mentioned the sick workers from earlier, he cut me off. He said I was being paranoid and dramatic. He said that food waste was expensive and cruise operations required practical decision-making. He said if I reported this up the chain or created problems, He'd document me for being unable to handle the pressure of cruise ship operations. What do you do when the person responsible for food safety is the one ordering you to ignore safety violations? When the hierarchy that's supposed to protect passengers is the mechanism enabling danger? I stood in that galley at 1 a.m., looking at hundreds of pounds of compromised food, knowing it should be thrown out, knowing it would be served instead. And I made my choice. I went back to my cabin and tried to convince myself that maybe Guillaume had more experience, that maybe I was being overcautious, that maybe everything would be fine. Everything was not fine. Over the next 48 hours, I watched meals prepared from that compromised refrigeration unit, combined with contamination from sick workers, go out to 3,000 passengers. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, buffet service. Thousands of plates of food that I knew had been stored improperly, handled by people who were actively ill, prepared under conditions that violated every food safety protocol I'd learned. And I said nothing. I supervised the prep work, I plated the dishes, I ensured they looked beautiful and appetizing, and I sent them out knowing they were potentially dangerous. The first cases started appearing 36 hours after embarkation. Passengers reporting to medical with vomiting, diarrhea, fever. By hour 48, the medical bay was overwhelmed. Hundreds of passengers sick, unable to leave their cabins, suffering from what was obviously norovirus or similar contamination. The outbreak spread rapidly, facilitated by the ship's closed environment. Buffet service became a transmission vector. Shared spaces became contaminated. Within 72 hours, we had 473 confirmed cases. The ship went into crisis mode. Enhanced cleaning protocols, medical staff working around the clock, some port visits canceled. But the public response from the cruise line was coordinated and dishonest. They announced that passengers had brought illness aboard, that norovirus was common in the general population, that the ship's food preparation had nothing to do with the outbreak. They cited CDC statistics about community spread, emphasized that their kitchens met all regulatory standards, framed the outbreak as unfortunate but unavoidable. The media coverage mostly repeated this narrative. Some bad luck with passengers bringing illness aboard, nothing to do with food safety or company negligence. But inside the galley, we all knew the truth. The outbreak started too quickly and spread too systematically to be passenger-introduced. The pattern matched foodborne contamination perfectly. And those of us who'd been working those first days knew exactly where it came from. Sick workers handling food and compromised refrigeration that should have resulted in massive disposal. We'd caused this outbreak through negligence and cost-cutting. And the company was successfully shifting blame to passengers who'd paid thousands of dollars to get sick on vacation. Guillaume called a mandatory meeting for all kitchen staff 3 days into the outbreak. He explained that the company was conducting an internal investigation, that we would all be interviewed, that it was essential we present a unified account. He reminded us that our kitchen had passed all inspections, that our protocols were solid, that any suggestion of negligence would be unfair and inaccurate. The message was clear without being explicitly stated. The official story was that passengers brought illness aboard, and if anyone contradicted that story, they'd face consequences. When I was interviewed by company investigators, I had my chance to tell the truth. Describe the sick workers, the compromised refrigeration, Guillaume's decision to serve food that should have been discarded. But I also knew that telling the truth meant ending my career. Guillaume would deny everything. Other staff would back him up because they were equally implicated, and I'd be the problem employee who made accusations he couldn't prove. I'd be fired. Probably blacklisted from cruise work, possibly held liable for losses the company incurred. All for telling a truth that wouldn't change anything. Because the outbreak had already happened, the company had already decided on their narrative. So I lied. I told the investigators our protocols were followed, that I hadn't witnessed any safety violations, that the outbreak must have come from external sources. I validated the false narrative, became complicit in the cover-up, chose my career over honesty. The investigators seemed satisfied. They weren't looking for truth anyway, just documentation that would support the predetermined conclusion. Within a week, the official report was released. No evidence of food safety violations. Outbreak likely caused by passenger-introduced illness. Kitchen operations met all standards. Case closed. But 473 people had gotten sick from food I helped prepare under conditions I knew were unsafe. Some of them were elderly with compromised immune systems. Some were children. A few ended up hospitalized when we reached port. They'd paid for vacations they couldn't enjoy, suffered for days, potentially faced lasting health consequences. And they were blamed for bringing illness aboard, when the truth was that we'd poisoned them through negligence, and then covered it up to protect the company. The guilt of that is complicated. Part of me argues that I was following orders, that Guillaume made the decisions, and I was just a sous chef without authority. Part of me knows that's exactly the rationalization that allows institutional evil to function. That everyone up and down the chain tells themselves they were just following orders, just protecting their jobs, just being practical. And collectively, all of those individual acts of cowardice create systems where 400 people get poisoned and nobody is held accountable. Does it matter that I tried to do the right thing initially? That I reported the sick workers? That I flagged the refrigeration failure? Or does the fact that I backed down when threatened erase any credit for trying? These questions have followed me through 3 more contracts, through dozens more cruises, through hundreds of meal services where I maintain proper protocols and feel like I'm trying to compensate for past failures. The truth about cruise ship kitchens is that food safety depends entirely on whether management decides to enforce protocols. The regulations exist, the standards are clear, but when operations and profit conflict with safety, the decision almost always favors keeping the ship running. Sick workers get pressured to work through illness because finding replacements is inconvenient. Compromised food gets served because discarding it costs money. Safety violations get covered up because acknowledging them creates liability. And staff who witness these problems stay silent because speaking up costs them their careers. Passengers assume that because cruise ships are regulated, because they pass inspections, because they advertise safety and quality, that their food is being prepared under proper conditions. They don't know about the sick workers handling their meals, about the refrigeration failures, about the pressure kitchen staff face to cut corners and stay silent. They don't know that when outbreaks happen, the default response is to blame passengers rather than investigate kitchen operations honestly. They trust the system, and that trust is being systematically violated by people like me who know better, but choose self-preservation over truth. 3 years after that outbreak, after working my way up to senior sous chef with excellent performance reviews and commendations for my protocol adherence, I think about quitting regularly, finding land-based restaurant work where oversight is better, where I'm not trapped on a ship with passengers getting sick from my food. But land-based chef positions pay less, offer fewer opportunities, don't include the travel and adventure that initially attracted me to cruise work. And there's a darker truth I have to acknowledge. I'm still here because the system rewards people who play along, who understand that operational flexibility means sometimes compromising standards, who know when to stay silent. I wish I could say I'd handle things differently now, that if I witnessed similar violations, I'd report them regardless of consequences. But I'm not sure that's true. The same pressures exist, the same hierarchies, the same economic coercion. And I've learned that speaking up in institutional settings rarely works the way you hope it will. Usually, it just gets you labeled as difficult, marked as someone who doesn't understand how things work, quietly pushed out while the system continues unchanged. Maybe that's just rationalization. Maybe I'm still just a coward who values his career over doing the right thing. But 3 years of watching how the industry operates has taught me that individual courage often just results in individual punishment while the system remains untouched. So here's my confession, the one that passengers should hear but won't. That outbreak wasn't an accident or bad luck. It was caused by deliberate decisions to prioritize operations over safety and then covered up through coordinated dishonesty. 473 people got sick because kitchen staff were pressured to work while ill, because compromised food was served instead of discarded, because a sous chef named Chen saw violations and stayed silent when threatened. The cruise line was never held accountable. The passengers were blamed for their own illness, and I kept my job by lying about what I witnessed. That's the reality of food safety on cruise ships when systems fail and everyone involved chooses complicity over truth. And until enough people refuse to stay silent, until consequences exist for management that prioritizes profit over safety, it will keep happening. Different ships, different outbreaks, same pattern. People getting sick, companies denying responsibility, crew members like me carrying guilt we've earned through cowardice and silence. I helped poison 473 people, and nobody except me and the other kitchen staff will ever know the truth. That's the secret nobody wants from their cruise ship chef. My name is Liam, and on March 14th at 2:37 a.m., I was going to jump. I had it planned down to the minute, had chosen the location, had written the letters I'd never send, had made peace with the decision that ending things was easier than enduring one more day of the crushing isolation that comes from working 11-month contracts on a floating city where nobody really knows you exist. I was 26 years old, working as an IT technician on the Celestial Voyage, and I'd reached the point where dying felt like relief rather than tragedy. What I didn't know was that a random encounter with someone I barely knew would interrupt that plan, would lead to a conversation that literally saved my life, and would eventually connect me to an underground network of crew members who keep each other alive in an industry that treats mental health like an inconvenient liability rather than a crisis worth addressing. Depression on cruise ships isn't rare. It's epidemic. You're working 12 to 14-hour days, 7 days a week, for months without a break. You're living in a cabin the size of a closet, often sharing it with a stranger. You're thousands of miles from family and friends, communicating through expensive internet that barely works. You're performing emotional labor constantly, smiling for passengers while dealing with homesickness and exhaustion, and the grinding monotony of the same routes, the same ports, the same routine repeated endlessly. And you're doing all of this while being told that you're lucky to have the job, that crew members are replaceable, that showing weakness or struggling means you're not cut out for cruise ship life. The pressure is designed to make you stay silent, to handle everything alone, to never admit you're drowning until you've already gone under. I'd been on back-to-back contracts for 11 months, signed on for 6 months initially, then got talked into extending for another 5 because they needed IT staff, and the money was good. Except the money doesn't matter when you're so isolated and exhausted that existence becomes purely mechanical. Wake up, work, eat, sleep, repeat. No days off, no privacy, no space to process what you're feeling. I stopped calling my family because hearing their voices made the homesickness unbearable. I stopped socializing with other crew because small talk felt impossible when I could barely hold myself together. I became invisible, the IT guy who fixed problems and then disappeared back to his cabin. And nobody noticed because crew members becoming withdrawn and isolated is so common, it's practically expected. The breaking point came on March 13th. I got a message from my sister that my father had been hospitalized with a heart attack. Serious but stable, she said. Family was gathering. She hoped I could come home. I went to HR immediately, requested emergency leave, explained the situation. They were sympathetic in that performative way that means nothing. They explained that mid-contract leave was difficult to arrange, that finding my replacement would take time, that they'd see what they could do. 3 hours later, they told me I could leave in 6 weeks when my contract ended, but not before. 6 weeks. My father could die in 6 weeks, and I'd be stuck on this ship fixing passengers' internet connections while my family dealt with the crisis without me. Something broke in me that day. Not dramatically, not like a crisis you can point to. Just a quiet internal collapse where I realized I couldn't do this anymore. Couldn't pretend to care about my job, couldn't fake being functional, couldn't keep existing in this liminal space that felt less like living and more like suspended animation. That night, I started planning. I researched the ship's schedule, identified isolated deck areas with minimal camera coverage, calculated timing that would minimize chances of intervention. The planning gave me something to focus on, made the decision feel methodical and rational rather than the desperate act of someone who'd lost all hope. I chose Deck 2, the restricted crew maintenance area, 2:30 a.m. when shift changes meant minimal foot traffic. I'd been working on ships long enough to know where the blind spots were, how to move through crew areas without being noticed. The plan was simple. Climb the rail, don't hesitate, let the ocean take over. People don't survive those falls. The impact alone is usually fatal, and if not, hypothermia and drowning finish it quickly. It would look like an accident, spare my family the stigma of suicide, save the company the liability investigation. Tidy, efficient, final. At 2:15 a.m., I left my cabin, walked through the empty corridors, took the crew stairs to Deck 2, moved toward the rail I'd identified. The ocean was black and infinite, ship cutting through it under a sky full of stars that should have been beautiful, but just felt indifferent. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, psyching myself up, trying to override the survival instinct that makes jumping harder than planning to jump. I was gripping the rail, preparing to climb it, when I heard a voice behind me asking if I was okay. Her name was Tessa. She worked in housekeeping, night shift like me, and she'd come to Deck 2 because she couldn't sleep, and this was one of the few places crew could be alone. We'd crossed paths maybe twice in 11 months, never had a real conversation. She was Filipino, probably early 30s, and she looked at me with this expression that wasn't alarm or judgment, just tired recognition. Like she knew exactly what she was seeing, what I'd been about to do. She asked again if I was okay. And something about the gentleness in her voice, the complete lack of performance or obligation, made me honest. I told her no. I told her I'd been about to jump. I told her I didn't think I could do this anymore. Have you ever had someone respond to your worst moment with complete, unpanicked acceptance? Tessa didn't freak out, didn't try to talk me down with platitudes about how life was precious or things would get better. She just nodded, said she understood, and asked if I wanted to talk for a bit before making any final decisions. Not a manipulation, not an intervention technique. Just a genuine offer from someone who seemed to understand that sometimes people need to be heard before they can choose to keep living. We sat on that deck for 4 hours, talked about everything that had led to that moment. The isolation, the exhaustion, the way cruise ship life grinds you down until you're just going through motions without any real connection to yourself or others. I told her about my father, about HR's refusal to let me go home, about feeling trapped and powerless. She told me about her own struggles, about the 3 months last year when she'd been where I was, about the night someone else had found her and talked her through it. And then she told me about something I'd never heard of, the Underground Crew Mental Health Network. Turns out, there's an entire informal support system that operates completely outside official channels. Crew members across different ships and cruise lines who've dealt with depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, all of it. They connect through private messaging apps, through codes and referrals that keep it hidden from management. When someone's struggling, they get connected to others who understand, who can talk them through the crisis, who know resources and strategies that actually help. It exists because the official company mental health support is worthless. You report depression or suicidal thoughts, you get labeled as unstable, your contract gets terminated, you lose income, and potentially get blacklisted. So crew members who need help learn to hide it from the company and seek support from each other instead. Tessa offered to connect me. No pressure, no obligations, just access to people who understood what I was going through and might be able to help. At that point, talking to her for 4 hours had already shifted something. Not fixed anything, not made the depression disappear, but reminded me that connection was possible, that I wasn't as completely alone as I'd felt. I agreed to try the network before making any permanent decisions. Tessa sent a secure message right there, and within an hour I had responses from 3 other crew members on different ships offering to talk whenever I needed. Over the next weeks, those connections saved my life repeatedly. Crew members from different countries and departments who understood the specific hell of cruise ship depression. They helped me navigate the HR system to finally get emergency leave approved. They gave me strategies for managing the isolation and emotional labor. They reminded me during the darkest moments that other people had survived this and found ways to keep going. And when I finally got home, saw my father recovering, spent time with my family, they celebrated with me like it was their own victory. Because in a way, it was. Every crew member who makes it through a contract without breaking is a collective achievement against a system designed to use people up and discard them. I finished that contract, took a month break on land, decided to return for one more contract with better boundaries and connection to the support network. And somewhere during that next contract, I transitioned from someone being helped to someone helping others. Tessa taught me how to recognize the signs, how to reach out to crew members who were isolating, how to have the conversations that might interrupt someone else's plan the way mine had been interrupted. Over the past 2 years, I've talked to maybe 20 crew members who were in crisis. I don't know if I saved anyone's life the way Tessa saved mine, but I know that some of them are still here, still working, still fighting through the depression and isolation with support from people who actually understand. The network has grown. Hundreds of crew members now, maybe thousands, all connected through encrypted apps and coded language that keeps it hidden from companies that would rather pretend the mental health crisis doesn't exist. We share resources, strategies, contacts for therapists who do video sessions, techniques for managing depression while working impossible schedules. We've created what the cruise industry refuses to provide: actual mental health support that doesn't punish people for struggling. But here's what passengers need to understand. The crew members serving your meals, cleaning your cabins, entertaining your children, fixing your technical problems. Many of them are struggling with serious depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts. not because they're weak or unstable, but because cruise ship working conditions create mental health crises by design. 11-month contracts with no days off, isolation from support systems, emotional labor requirements, inability to leave when family emergencies happen. All of it systematically destroys mental health. And when crew members break down, the company response is usually termination rather than treatment, which creates an environment where people suffer in silence rather than seek help. That night on deck 2, I came within minutes of dying because I couldn't see any other escape from a situation the company had created and refused to acknowledge. If Tessa hadn't randomly appeared, if she hadn't recognized what was happening, if she hadn't offered connection instead of judgment, I wouldn't be here. That randomness haunts me sometimes. How many other crew members didn't get interrupted? How many jumped or overdosed or found other ways to end things because they didn't know the support network existed or couldn't reach out in time? The company doesn't track those numbers, doesn't acknowledge the problem, certainly doesn't provide real solutions. At 28, after 3 years of being part of this underground network, I've learned that staying alive on cruise ships sometimes requires building your own support systems because the official ones are designed to protect the company rather than the crew. I've learned that being honest about mental health struggles takes courage that most people don't have because the consequences for honesty are too severe. And I've learned that sometimes one conversation, one moment of genuine connection, can be the difference between dying and finding reasons to keep going. I still work cruise ships, still deal with the depression that comes from isolation and exhaustion. But I'm connected to hundreds of other crew members who understand, who check in on each other, who've built a community that keeps us alive despite working in conditions designed to break us. Tessa and I still talk regularly. She calls me her success story, though we both know I'm also someone who almost became a statistic. The difference between those outcomes was just timing and randomness, and one person who cared enough to interrupt a suicide attempt with an offer of conversation. That's the truth about cruise ship crew mental health. The crisis is real, it's widespread, and it's being managed entirely by crew members themselves because companies won't acknowledge it. We're keeping each other alive through underground networks, through coded check-ins and late-night conversations and shared strategies for surviving environments that systematically destroy mental health. If you're crew and you're reading this, know that the network exists. Reach out. Someone will respond. And if you're a passenger, understand that the people serving you are often struggling in ways you can't see, managing mental health crises while maintaining the performance of happy hospitality staff. We're here, we're surviving, and we're doing it by taking care of each other, since nobody else will. These 10 confessions reveal what really happens behind the cruise ship fantasy. If these stories made you think differently about the industry, subscribe to Mr. Nightvale for more hidden truths that need to be told. Drop a comment sharing which confession shocked you most, and hit that notification bell so you never miss the secrets they don't want you to know. Until next time, stay curious and stay vigilant.